Hello. Today we're going to be looking at Locating the Library and Institutional Oppression by Nina de Jesus. Before we dive right into the article, I would like to take a moment to define the idea of institutional oppression. The National Equity Project does a great job of explaining the multifaceted nature of systematic oppression. In the lens for systematic oppression, they state, it may be that an organization creates a culture centered on dominant culture that makes it inhospitable to people of color. Though one might argue that these policies stem from individual beliefs, the institutional lens reveals how an organization's patterns are self-sustaining and thus more than the sum of its individual actors. With this in mind, let's look at the central argument of this paper. In this article, Nina de Jesus explores how Enlightenment ideas created the foundation for libraries as institutions. She goes on to explain how those ideas were not as neutral as we'd like to believe, but actually helped to create the foundation for white supremacy. Because of that connection, she explains that libraries cannot be distinguished either from their historical roots nor from the contemporary context within a white supremacist settler state. The author focuses on the social and political aspects of Enlightenment thought because of their enduring impact in the United States. She argues that the values of Enlightenment have not been as universally appealing as people would like to believe. They have always been resisted by indigenous peoples and continue to be resisted today, primarily because they have been used, and still are being used, as validation for the genocide of indigenous peoples and the settler state mentality. In the article, When Light Becomes White, the term enlightenment was used to explain this idea. The author said, a cultural phenomenon that we, like it or not, take more or less for granted now, the equation of whiteness and superior civilization, or civilization at all, was the result of long discursive development germinating in the early modern ideas of man's perfectibility and culminating in the light of white man's skin color. Jesus argues that the original purpose of libraries was political rather than educationally motivated, helping to create better citizens according to the democratic ideologies put forth by the Enlightenment. This means that libraries cannot claim to be their neutral or apolitical institutions they would like to believe. Furthermore, they are automatically a perpetrator of institutional oppression because they were created from the oppressive ideologies of the Enlightenment, and they are perpetuating them by helping people become better citizens of a country also based on those ideologies. This is still occurring in libraries today because of their goal of helping to create informed citizen and better citizens as a liberal institution, and that liberalism is the modern-day embodiment of Enlightenment values. Nina de Jesus uses Andrea Smith's Logics of White Supremacy as a way to understand how white supremacy is established and to explain the library's role in perpetuating its ideas. Smith argues that a logic of pillars is a better way to understand racism, and she uses the three pillars of genocide, slavery, and Orientalism, which are anchored in capitalism, colonialism, and war, respectively. It's important to note that she explains the pillars are best understood as logics rather than categories signifying specific groups of people. For each pillar, Nina goes through and explains the concept and then ties it specifically to libraries. The logic of slavery argues that the enslavement of black people is a necessary part of capitalism. Capitalism requires all people to become commodity, to sell their labor to maintain the system, and applies a racial hierarchy that renders black people as inherently enslavable. Slavery is not the result of capitalism, but rather that capitalism itself is structured around the logic. When considering how this might affect libraries, de Jesus argues that when it comes to intellectual property, black individuals and creators have never been given the credit they deserve, and that the rise of capitalism and the rise of intellectual property rights are undeniably connected. Further, libraries have played a significant role in ensuring the stability of intellectual property rights, and that our system for creating authority records relies on commodifying and creating ownership for creative work. Second, the logic of genocide states indigenous peoples must disappear. In fact, they must always be disappearing in order to enable non-indigenous peoples' rightful claim to land. It has already been established that libraries were created and continue to create informed citizens for the sake of democracy. But that is only possible by continuing the values of settler colonialism and the genocide of indigenous people. Therefore, libraries are helping to continue a system that supports these ideologies. The logic of Orientalism marks certain peoples or nations as inferior and deems them to be a constant threat to the well-being of empire. Consequently, Orientalism serves as the anchor of war because it allows the United States to justify being in a constant state of war to protect itself from its enemies. Nina de Jesus argues that libraries disguise their Orientalism by invoking the sense of neutrality, but she has already established why libraries are inherently not neutral spaces. Our collections and many other functions, such as cataloging, show the inherent biases that are still prevalent in our spaces. When looking at the collection more closely and the information we are choosing to share through them, you can see that default whiteness is established as the norm. I think the most important sentence in this article our libraries as institutions were created not only for a specific ideological purpose, but for an ideology that is fundamentally oppressive in nature. As such, the failings of libraries can be reinterpreted not as libraries failing to live up to their ideals and values, but rather as symptoms and evidence of this foundational and oppressive ideology. So where do we go from here? In her conclusion, the author makes it clear that she is addressing the field of librarianship as a whole with this article, because that is what it's going to take to make the structural changes necessary in our field. She argues that to disconnect ourselves from these ideologies, it would take breaking down and disrupting the internalized ideas that we have continued to allow us to strengthen settler colonialism and structural racism. This would not be simple and would require big changes to the systems and structures we currently have in place. But she did leave on a somewhat hopeful note that this could be possible. The questions I pose to you are this. When Andrea Smith's Logics of White Supremacy new to you? And did you find it a helpful way of better understanding institutional racism? The article argues that due to the nature and purpose of libraries, it's impossible for them to be value neutral and apolitical. Do you agree with her assessment? Why or why not? 3. Have you witnessed the effects of institutional racism in libraries? And did you take any action to address or change these issues? 4. In her conclusion, she writes, there is perhaps a worthwhile solution in decoupling libraries from their avowed goal in propping up and strengthening settler democracies. This could allow us to preserve the institution, but would require drastic and daring changes to the overall structure and organization of libraries. What do you think these drastic and daring institutional changes might look like? This has been my presentation on locating the library and institutional oppression. Thank you for joining me.